Hello and welcome to Soberania, the Mexican Politics Podcast. I'm your co host, Jose Luis Granado Ceja, Mexican born journalist living and working in Mexico City. I'm a staff writer at Venezuela Analysis, as well as host of their podcast. And as always, I'm joined by my co host, Kurt Hackbarth. Kurt, how you doing? Welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Jose Luis. My name is Kurt Hackbarth, writing for Jacobin Magazine in the United States and Sentido Común here in Mexico. Ready for, and we've got a lot of stuff today, another episode of Soberania.
All right, so just to give you the rundown of the beginning, I think it's helpful. We're going to be talking about the rapid pace that Morena is pursuing when it comes to these constitutional reforms. It's refreshing to see them actually following through on that mandate that they received in the June 2nd election. And so we've got lots of updates when it comes to the constitutional reforms. What is Morena been up to? A lot of people are kind of on this summer lull, a little bit distracted. But there's lots happening as well. We're going to provide you with an update on the situation in Venezuela. Obviously, we spent a lot of time on that last episode. I want to cue you in on what's been happening thus far, as well as the Mexico connection. Of course, there is a lot to be said about Mexico's role in all of this. We're going to provide a very quick update on the situation between Mexico and Ecuador, specifically the case of former Vice President Jorge Glass and the steps that Mexico has taken to try to protect him. And then after that, we'll be also going to our classic losers and haters. We're going to be looking at efforts by the opposition to subvert the will of the electorate. Unfortunately, as we know, they try to secure what they couldn't get at the ballot box via the courts. This is a familiar tune here in Latin America. So we're going to begin with the constitutional reforms, some of the progress that we've seen. There's a lot happening already, which is very exciting. Like I said, I think this is somewhat uncommon, I would say, in electoral politics and left politics. Oftentimes you see this massive mandate, everyone gets excited. And then when people start paying attention, there's kind of this sense, the lack of urgency, the kind of settling things down. That's not the case here in Mexico. So I'll hand it over to you, Kurt. Let us know, where are we at? We'll go through a bunch of them, and I'll walk you through the slides as well, the different kinds of posts here that we have on the topic.
Yeah, Jose Luis. So I think that's a really important intro that you just made to this topic. You know, as those of us who lived in the States, who grew up in the States or followed U.S. politics, we're very used to this phenomenon of frittering away a mandate or losing a moment, right? The example that comes to mind is, the Obama landslide in 2008, set up by the Democrats' sweep of the Congress in 2006. So when they had that nearly 60 vote, they had 59 votes in the Senate, they had a massive majority in the House for 2 years and frittered it away, leading to the losses in the 2010 elections. This is one example of several we could cite. That's not happening down here. And it's very gratifying to see that Morena is wasting no time in setting up the constitutional reforms so that when the full Congress gets back in session in September, they're going to start passing those through. They're just going to pass those through. They want to get as many of those passed before López Obrador leaves office and the 1st of October, right? They've moved up they've shortened the presidential transition time, which used to be excessively long in Mexico. The president used to, the election would be in the summer and they wouldn't take office until the 1st of December. And then they have 1 month to throw a budget together. So now the new president, Claudia Sheinbaum, will take office on the 1st of October, and they want to have as many of those through before she takes office and before AMLO leaves. So how are they setting that up? And as you say, Jose Luis, they're taking advantage of the fact that the Supreme Court's on vacation, with their fat salaries and their drivers and their cars and all their benefits and all their perks. They're off. A lot of people are off, So now's the time, right, while the cat's away, to, get some of this going. And so what they're doing is they're approving these constitutional reforms in the Constitutional Reforms Committee, La Comisión de Puntos Constitucionales, so that once it's through committee, it can get right to the floor right at the beginning of September, right? One of the reforms that we're going to be talking about, because they're really, they're trying to march through all the 20, is I think one of the most exciting for Jose Luis and myself, and not only, right? Because it's really a policy centered on the working class, right? And this is, as we see here, the tweet from the head of the National Housing Authority, Infonavit, Carlos Martinez, who's very excited about this, as he should be. The constitutional reform will allow the National Housing Authority in Infonavit to build its own housing, right? Instead of going through a series of corrupt construction companies, as we saw in the Fox administration, which then go belly up and leave these half-built, shoddy, ramshackle, housing developments way far away from public transportation and from urban centers and from job centers. A lot of them are in deplorable conditions, through no fault of the residents, but the way they were built, barely 20 years after they were built. So this reform allows Infonavit to build its own housing, which then workers who cotizan, who are part of the formal employment system, who have deductions from their checks, can rent at a social rent that can't exceed a certain percentage of their salary, right? So it's a social rent that has to be capped at a percentage of salary, right? In this time of rampant gentrification, rampant renting, rental increases, rampant housing increases internationally. So a social rent that can then be put towards the price of the home after a number of years, I think 10 years, if the worker decides to buy that house, right? So it's a rent to buy program. The initial idea was to build 500,000 units. Some have talked about 1 million, but I think the official proposal is 500,000 units. It's not enough. It's not enough for a country of 126 million people, but it is an encouraging start, Jose Luis.
Absolutely. And, just to remind our viewers and listeners, the way the system worked before is that basically what Infonavit would do, it would give you a cheap loan so that you could use to contribute towards the building or the purchasing of your own home. This is a pretty big departure from that. This is a very different kind of model. The idea here is to make it more accessible by basically taking the market out of the equation.
That's right.
To make it so that this housing is built by, paid for by the state, subsidized by the state. And I think, frankly, with this being such a hot topic in so many countries, Mexico is obviously not unique in this, and the housing crisis, of the lack of affordable housing, is to really kind of confront the market, right? All of the interests that are behind construction, all of the financial speculation that happens around land, et cetera, et cetera. Well, the idea here is that there is a direct intervention by the state, and it's an issue that's personally been something important to me as a young person who's unable to afford his own place. I would say that this is the right way to go. This is how you do it. You have to take on the interests of the market. You have to confront it. And who's capable of doing that? I think it's the state empowered by the citizenry. And I think it's also important to highlight it's not quite enough. I always point to Venezuela, which has built almost 5 million units of housing. And I think in a much, much smaller country, that's how you really make an impact. That's how you actually stop allowing the financial markets to dictate what the housing situation looks like. I mean, ask any developer, right? They're only going to build housing that's profitable. And plain and simple, right? That's why there is an undersupply, et cetera, et cetera. So it's really good to see them moving on this issue. I went to a day-long forum here in Mexico City around the issue of housing. Carlos Martinez was there, and there was a lot of emphasis on this, on the shift that Infonavit is taking. I think I will say one thing, which is that, Mexico used to have a very strong tenants' rights movement. A lot of that was co-opted, like so many other of the worker, people's organizations. And became part of the corporatist model. It's very difficult. There's still social housing programs here in Mexico City, but basically you have to kind of know the right people, a leader, they call them, who's able to secure the land and then negotiate with the government, and then they build. In fact, I went to the unveiling of a housing project here in Mexico City, and the jefe de gobierno, Martí Batres, the governor of Mexico City, was there. And it was good to hear the emphasis that the city government as well is putting on this. He talked in his intervention about the fact that, I came into this because he's an interim. He wasn't directly elected. Obviously, Claudia Sheinbaum was the governor of Mexico City, but she stepped down to run for president. And so he's been in charge of the Mexico City government. He said, well, I only had basically about a year when I took office, and discussing with my advisors and with citizens, we decided that the priority would be housing. So this is something longstanding and something that I think Clara Brugada is going to follow through on as well. Obviously, she comes from a social movement around housing, around water, is familiar, involved with this. And I wanted to bring up this string. We don't really have a lot of time to get into every detail of it, but I found it really informative because there's very little information about one of the flagship programs of Clara Brugada. And we hope that, well, she's promised that she's going to expand on this. She was the mayor of the borough of Iztapalapa. She built now 13 utopias. They recently unveiled the latest one, which is, I'll read here. The utopias created by Mexico City's borough of Iztapalapa are a brilliant example of collective amenity and public infrastructure of care, and the most inspiring ongoing municipal project with which I'm familiar. This is David Madden. He's a sociologist at the London School of Economics. Every city should be learning from Iztapalapa and Mexico City. And he goes on to talk about everything that is important about this. But the point that I would say is, for example, here where he has this tweet, the idea is a network of safe, free public sites that provide poor and working class people with what they need for the maintenance, enhancement, enjoyment of everyday life: food, health, elder care, childcare, a cheap laundromat. These are photos from Utopia Mellehualco. So this is just an example of kind of the thinking behind this. It's about socializing the costs that all of us have to endure around housing, around these care costs, et cetera, et cetera. That's what the state should be there for. And I think we're seeing a very interesting example of that here in Mexico City. And I think we'll see it translated to the national level. I think we'll see what we saw in Iztapalapa expanded to Mexico City. As a resident of the city, I'm very excited by it because I'm a working class person who looks to benefit from this. I think this is really, like David Madden said, people should be looking to Mexico City, to Iztapalapa, to see these examples of what it's like to socialize those costs. So when we think about housing, when we think about public infrastructure, there's a lot of really exciting things here in Mexico that I think our people should be paying more attention to. But that's obviously not the only thing that is happening right now when it comes to the constitutional reform. So I wanted to kind of speedily move through to the next one here.
Let me just, I just wanted to add a quick point on
go ahead.
There's so much to say on this because it's such an exciting topic. We just saw in the Olympics how Rebecca Andrade, the Brazilian gymnast, won the Olympic gold, who came from the favelas. And she came from the favelas and got her initial sports training at a public facility, that was geared towards poor and working class people, and won the Olympic gold. Against giants like Simone Biles and others, right? Yeah. So this project also has the Utopias. It has a pool, it has sports facilities, it has recreational facilities and high quality, right? So it's not just this idea of handouts and going and getting public services and making people feel guilty about it, but creating this idea of the fact that working class communities also deserve high quality leisure and sports facilities. My other point,
David calls it populist public luxury. I like that term.
I like that term, populist public luxury. And we saw how the Brazil model is something to look to together with the Utopias, right? Martí Batres has also come out with a proposal for rent control in Mexico City, that rents cannot go up higher than inflation. Right, that's something that needs to be nationwide. But you can see the priority on housing here. So it's not just building public housing; it's also controlling out of control rents, and that's very important. You just think about what percentage now of housing in the United States is controlled by funds like BlackRock, and they can control and corner the market. I mean, this is the idea of get that out of the hands of the vulture funds. Get housing out of the hands of the vulture funds. Otherwise, once they've gobbled it up, it's too late. Right. And then one final point on this, which I think is important. The one negative here is that, or the potential negative, is that this housing benefit is for people who are in the formal economy. Just like, the new pension benefit that you can, retire 100% of your last pension up to the average salary of the Eames. That's also for formal sector workers. So it's important that the half of the country that doesn't work in the formal sector is not left behind by these reforms. That's something to really, keep an eye on.
Absolutely. Okay, so jumping ahead here to the next issue that we want to talk about, which is trains. Who doesn't like trains? I think fans of public housing are also fans of
Oh yeah.
trains and infrastructure, right? I know I am. I'm not a specialist in this, but I've always kind of, considered it a hobby of mine to pay attention to these kinds of issues because they can be transformative. And we saw this interesting tweet here where even the PRI, who is responsible for the privatization of trains started with de la Madrid, but really consolidated under Salinas de Gortari, the widespread, large-scale privatization of so much industry, so much of what public assets, now regret it. And here we have this tweet from El Chapucero. He says, the priistas who privatized the rail lines, 30 years later, they realized it was a mistake. And additionally, they recognize that it negatively affected many Mexicans with that decision. And so we've seen this emphasis on trains, the Tren Maya, the Interoceánico over the isthmus of Tehuantepec. But obviously, there is now this push to where López Obrador, starting with him and actually carried through by Claudia Sheinbaum, who's used similar language, to say we need to rescue passenger rail in this country. And before we started, Kurt, we were talking about, imagine if we had high-speed rail. I specifically think it would be great to have Chinese assistance with that. They built an incredible network, thousands upon thousands of
20
kilometers.
years they've done that.
In 20 years. Imagine what we could do with them together in another, the length of the sexennial. Claudia Sheinbaum could hand over a high-speed rail network that covers, I would say, 90% of the territory, right? Because most of the vias, the actual right-of-ways, are still public. They've just been offered in a concession to private firms of high-speed rail, right? To hop on a train and be in Querétaro in an hour, right? It would transform this country's economy. It would actually help develop the domestic market as opposed to the export-oriented market that we kind of have today.
Yeah, and actually one of the priority lines for Sheinbaum is precisely that. It's Mexico City going through Querétaro to Guadalajara, and then the northern link that goes up through Nuevo León and up to the border at Nuevo Laredo. Right, those are the two priority lines. And again, the focus is to start first where the lines already are, and where there already are private lines running on concessions, and basically it's a use it or lose it thing. Offer passenger service, or we will. Mm-hmm.
So we're seeing them taking action on this, pushing this agenda item forward, and that's really encouraging. And I think we will see, this will be probably one of the legacies of Claudia Sheinbaum, and likely will have significant reverberations for the country. Moving on to the next one, because we do have a lot of things that are happening here. We have good news when it comes to the minimum wage. So the minimum wage, again, talking about the neoliberal period, was largely frozen for years, untouched. The same thing, the PRI also expressed regret over that.
That's right.
Recent Congress, saying we shouldn't have done that. Well, I think they're realizing the price of those decisions now with being punished at the polls. But now in the commission, in the Congress, by a unanimous vote.
Yeah, a lot of people are going unanimously. Nobody dares to vote against them. It's really interesting. When they come to the floor, we'll see. But in committee, they're going through like hotcakes.
Oh yeah, I mean, it's kind of a bit like the reverse ratchet, right? This saying that like the right pulls things to the right, and then the left keeps it from going back to the left. In this case, it's the opposite. Everything seems to be being pulled towards the left to more progressive positions. We see here as well. There's also been the commission here approving that the Article 123 of the Constitution, confirming that it cannot be increased by less than inflation, right? So making sure that basically not lose, right? We saw a over 100% increase in real terms of the minimum wage in the government of López Obrador, and that means we don't want to lose that, right? By keeping the increase too low, because you'll lose its purchasing power over time due to inflation. So keeping it nice and steady, and probably above inflation, because as we saw, the new doom and gloom scenarios that the business owners and the ruling class of Mexico said that increasing the minimum wage didn't come true. In fact, if anything, it helped stabilize the economy in an unstable time with COVID and everything happening.
That's right. And Sheinbaum has said that she wants to continue the minimum wage increases above inflation, about 10 to 15% per year, until it gets up to 2.5 canastas básicas, which is the canasta básica is the daily food intake that you need, right? To get it up to 2.5 canastas básicas. So that's where the minimum wage appears to be heading in the next sexennium.
And Kurt, here we have, on the other side of things, limiting the wages of the gilded bureaucracy, or the gilded judicial branch in this case. The Constitutional Commission approved that judges and magistrates cannot earn more than the president of the republic. In fact, that's in the Constitution as it is, but they've basically been ignoring it.
Mm-hmm.
And now we see yet another confirmation that this is what the population wants. And so we see action to follow through on that. This is no small thing, I think. I mean, it is offensive to understand that in a country that is still poor, where there is a lot of poverty, that you would have these kind of, extravagant, luxurious lifestyles for the bureaucracy. No one's saying they shouldn't earn a just income, but they can't be earning more than the president.
Well, it's precisely that. It's what Morena and AMLO has been saying for years, that you can't have, a poor government, a rich government with a poor people. And I mean, that was just, talk about an electoral winner. I mean, just in the pure political messaging alone, brilliant, right? But also, they set this up for themselves because it was already in the Constitution. They already passed a law against it. And what did these people do? Instead of simply just accepting it, right? And then it wouldn't have been an issue. What you saw throughout the whole sexennial was this whole gilded class fighting back against it to try to keep, their excessive salaries and perks and benefits. Right. So you saw the judicial branch, you saw the National Electoral Institute, you saw the supposedly autonomous, institutions of the executive branch. Right. All of them fighting tooth and claw to try to maintain these exorbitant salaries. So it was just a PR bonanza for Morena the whole time. It was a PR bonanza, right? Because they could just say, look, not only are they greedy as F, but they're violating the Constitution. And so now they're going through and they're strengthening the constitutional language and see if they're going to try to fight it again.
Yeah. And using that autonomy to kind of defend it, to say, no, we don't have to listen to we're the judicial branch. And so we will approve our own extravagant salaries without any kind of oversight. And I think it's pretty absurd, and you're right. And I think it didn't serve them very well, because now we see the population responding to that. I think in a lot of ways, the result that we saw on June 2nd is driven by that, of the sense of they are flaunting their authority on us when we are the sovereign, right? The sovereignty lies in the people, and they say, respect the will of the people. We got another one here. We've seen that now, Jóvenes Construyendo Futuro, Youth Building the Future, which is the social program aimed at giving young people a bit of a head start, people who struggle to find employment, come out of education, people who didn't have access to higher education, to give them that first job. This has now been elevated to the status of constitutional right. Now, so for some of our listeners, we've talked about this before. The Mexican Constitution is a bit different in the sense that it's kind of like super laws, right? You can put these blocks on these programs. I mean, of course, if you can pass constitutional amendments and you can reverse these, but it's obviously much, much harder than reversing a law with a simple majority down the road if the right wing returns to power, right? This basically makes it harder for them to reverse all of this.
Yeah, and we have a whole episode on that on our site about constitutional reforms and the idea, the conception of how the Mexican Constitution is different from the U.S. one, right? And we've seen that with the pensions, the universal pension, which was raised to the constitutional level. Now we're seeing something similar here. This is an apprenticeship program for young people between 18 and 29 who are neither studying nor employed, what they call despectively, pejoratively, the Nini phenomenon. Right. But the idea is really to attack the social problem of young people without, education or without skills or training. Right. And so the federal government pays their salary for a year, and you are then, you get a job placement. Now, part of the problem with the program is that sometimes the big corporations, gobble up some of these apprentices, and they wind up getting subsidized workers, which they don't need. So the program really needs to be streamlined in that respect. But I've also seen some very good examples, some excellent examples of young people, getting into smaller businesses, learning skills, learning creative skills, and then a lot of them wind up getting hired. afterwards. A significant number of them wind up getting hired, right? So the idea is to ensure that it doesn't become a subsidy program for, basically cheap interns for big corporations, right? Who then, splash, make splashy displays. And so those are the work placements that get seen first.
And of course, it's part of the security strategy, right? This is about attending to the root causes of violence in this country, which is actually giving people who may be seduced into the life of organized crime an alternative,
right,
an actual career path, right? This is what hugs, not bullets actually means. It doesn't mean hugging the criminals. It means hugging the population that may fall victim to the life of organized crime. And so I think that's hopefully worth remembering. So I wanted to, before we move on to our next topic, is just kind of open up the floor to you, Kurt, to give us a summary. What does all this mean, though? So we just went through all of these Jóvenes Construyendo Futuro, the minimum wage, the limits on the wages of the judicial branch, et cetera, et cetera. What does this tell us about the state of politics in Mexico today, August 6th?
Well, I think, you set it up there with the idea of this, the reverse ratchet effect, right? The idea is to waste no time, right? And to, push through a series of reforms, right, that strengthen the welfare state, yes, but also reaches out to populations that have been historically left behind, especially for the last 30 years in Mexico. For example, the idea of trains is linking rural and urban areas, right? So they got rid of the trains, and you just you had to depend on buses or cars or highways. You counted out a huge swath of the country, right, who are also hit by NAFTA and hit by massive migration. Right. You're also, you're addressing this young population, who came out of school, right, in the neoliberal era, and then were forced to either, if you came from a poor working class neighborhood, either accept a really shitty job, if there were, with exploitative conditions, or go into the police, or go into the army, or go into organized crime, or migrate. And those were your options. In a lot of cases, unfortunately, those are still the options for too many people, right? So it's reaching out to those populations, right? The working class was totally left behind in this country. That's another one, right? Due to, deliberate suppressing of wages, this idea that the only way Mexico could present itself as an attraction in the world was by offering cheap labor. So raising the minimum wage, pegging the minimum wage to inflation, raising, the pensions for people who are, in the formal sector, and addressing the housing issue, right? Because of Mexico's co-opted union system over the years, the Charo unions, there wasn't enough pressure from underneath for these real workers' issues, right? So they were left behind, right? And everything, in health and education and housing. Right, we've seen these utopias, which they want to now take national. Claudia Sheinbaum had a parallel program with the Pilares, right, which they want to take national. So this is the idea, and also the other important program to mention that hasn't gone through committee yet, but is on its way, is reducing the pension for women from 65 down to 60. Right, taking into account that a lot of times women have spent many years, in child rearing and family activities, caring for older people, and weren't able to build up through no fault of their own any kind of retirement system. Right, so this is what this idea also of the focus of the second, segundo piso is a focus on women. Right. This idea of Claudia Sheinbaum to extend, female MPs, right, female prosecutors, women's rights prosecutors in all judicial areas, and have the national hotline, and the pension for women. So there's going to be a real women's focus here, because these are the populations that were left behind, in summary. Rural populations, workers' populations, women, right? Huge swaths of the country were totally neglected, right? Leading to, what we've seen, mass migration, and this organized crime epidemic. So, and I think just on a more practical political level, it's a demonstration of political strength by Morena, and that they're not going to waste any time, and that they're going to unlike the Democrats after 2006, 2008, they're going to use their majorities to reshape the country, right? And I think, just to end, as always, there's always the worry, they're going to go too far. No, usually the danger is that they go too little. And I think there's a real conscious um, desire here to not waste this moment and stay on the too little side of the equation, which is usually what happens.
Yeah, and on the feminist file, right? One of the slogans that Claudia used was "Con Claudia llegamos todas," which is with Claudia, it's not just about her arriving to the presidency, but about elevating the interests of women. And it's really encouraging to see these women-specific social programs, priorities, obviously attending to the unique needs of the women population, the female population of Mexico. It's encouraging to see it. We talked about the national level, the local level here in Mexico City, right? Clara Brugada also, following up on Claudia's mandate here in the city. I'm encouraged by that. And I think it also is a reply to some of those criticisms we have heard, some legitimate, some I would question, from the feminist movement in Mexico and internationally around these issues, right? Of prioritizing the interests of women in particular because of that historic oppression. Anyway, so moving on to our next topic, we wanted to provide an update on the situation in Venezuela and Mexico's role in all of this. So I wanted to bring up here on the screen an article we just published this morning here on Venezuela Analysis. As I mentioned, I'm a writer at Venezuela Analysis. Just to give an update in terms of the situation, because it has been a major issue here in Latin America. It seems, in a sense, to have kind of fallen off the radar of many people. It was a hot topic on social media for a while, but as these things tend to go, the interest tends to wane. But I think it's important to pay attention because I think Mexico in particular has played a positive role when it comes to sovereignty, soberanía, right? There's again to emphasize on the importance of this. So just as an update, where we are at now is the National Electoral Council in Venezuela has actually handed over its data, the much disputed results by the opposition that actually has the hard numbers in terms of what the actual results were over to the Supreme Court. So this is relying on Venezuelan institutions to resolve the impasse, to resolve this ongoing dispute between the pro-government side and the opposition side, which maintains that they won, and that there's a fraud happening. And I think it's really important to emphasize this because, well, this could be in Mexico's future. We talked about this ahead of the election in June 2nd, that there was going to be this effort to try to discredit the result, to try to suggest that it's not legitimate, possibly engaging with accusations of fraud. It's historically important to pay attention to what happens here because I'm very familiar with the history of Venezuelan politics. I've been following the country closely since 2005. And we've seen this degradation in terms of the democratic character of the opposition in Venezuela, where because they lost consistently, they stopped wanting to engage with the political system and with the country's institutions, and instead started leaning on their strongholds of support in the economy, but mostly with the support of U.S. imperialism. And I worry that the same thing could happen here in Mexico, because as we just finished explaining, right, Morena's following through on its mandate. This is going to increase their support amongst the population. We didn't mention this in the previous segment, but López Obrador's approval rating is now above 80%. It's extraordinary. And so we may see the opposition be tempted to want to kind of pursue the same line. And so it's important to watch what's happening in Venezuela as a bit of a warning in terms of what is the tendency of the opposition to do in the cases where they suffer electoral defeats? Well, it's what we're watching here. So I think it's important to pay attention to Venezuela and also highlight something that I think deserves praise, to be honest. I've been very encouraged by the role played by Mexico, López Obrador in particular. As a result, we've seen the U.S. walk back its recognition of the opposition as the winner. We're going to play the clip from Matthew Miller just down the road here. But this happened, I think, in a lot of ways because of the mediation being done by Mexico, Brazil, and Colombia. López Obrador was clear from very early on. We have this video here about rejecting the interference of the Organization of American States meddling in Venezuela's elections, right? Saying outright. He was asked by the president, the OAS says that. What business is it of the OAS? Right. Why do they have to meddle? And so that is interference. This has been the intervention by López Obrador in this regional issue, and I think has been the correct one. We can stand that in contrast to Gabriel Boric from Chile, which took a very hard line against Venezuela on the night of the election, before any of these kinds of doubts had begun to circulate by the opposition themselves, saying, oh, those are not reliable results. They're hard to believe. I mean, that is a directly interventionist line. And I say this, I said this in a tweet. It's interesting to see the response to the US in all of this, to Mexico's position, to Brazil and Colombia's position, because Boric, with his hardline position, has totally marginalized himself from the situation. He is now on the outside looking in, and the actors that respect Venezuela's sovereignty are now directly involved with actually providing a solution, not going off with this bluster, not trying to kiss the feet of the US State Department, but actually promoting, respecting, defending sovereignty. And they're the ones who are acting to actually solve the issue. And that's because López Obrador took the correct position, as did Claudia Sheinbaum. Here, Claudia Sheinbaum criticized the U.S.-dominated Organization of the United States for its interventionist role. Again, saying, defend the self-determination of the people of Venezuela. Also calling for transparency, of course, saying that we want to have this data available. There's reasons why I think the Socialist Coalition in Venezuela has not published it. We have some articles there on Venezuela Analysis that talk about some of the thinking about why that hasn't been published, why they've avoided doing it. I think it's important to check it out, read it on the website there. But basically, there is the danger that the opposition will use that same data to perpetuate its own narrative. And so leave it in the hands of the Supreme Court, I think, is obviously the correct resolution. No, and I put this here as well, Kurt, your tweet here. Maybe you can expand on this here for our viewers and listeners.
Yeah, sure. So the other day, AMLO had an unusual sitting mañanera because he had an open security briefing that the press was invited to, and they had the mañanera in there. And so they asked him, of course, about the situation. This was the day after Antony Blinken, who's basically taken over U.S. foreign policy in the void of power, coming out of the White House, decided last Thursday to hastily recognize Edmundo Gonzalez, right? AMLO had some very strong words, diplomatic, but nonetheless, with regards to that. He said it was an act of recklessness, imprudencia, that does not help. And then in another clip, he goes on to lambaste the decision even further, right? So let's put that in a little bit of context and kind of analyze what's going on here, right? I have a column in Sentido Común, which came out last week, which circulated quite a bit. Thank you very much for that. Which talked about the 3 points of the AMLOian strategy here, which Jose Luis has laid out very well. Right. The first is respect for Venezuelan sovereignty and their own institutions, and giving them time for the institutions to go through their steps. Right. In what other country in the world are we so pending to every single little nuance of their electoral system? No, because it's the country's deal. But in Venezuela, we all think that we have the right now to be opining about how their electoral system works. It's a sovereignty issue straight up. Second, no intervention. That's very clear. That's Mexico's historic foreign policy, the Estrada Doctrine, but also no meddling and foreign interference from the United States and from the OAS especially, right? The Organization of American States. And thirdly, not just leave it at the rhetorical level, but to weave alliances. And so over the last week, a very effective de facto alliance has built up with, the three genuine, if we want to, cast some aspersions here, left powers in the region, right? Brazil, Colombia, and Mexico, right? Which created what I call a wall of containment against the North, a wall of containment, which gives breathing space and room for Venezuela. And you see it's working. We'll get to that in a moment, right? What the United States always wants is for their, all their color revolutions. They want, there to be, disorder in the streets, disorder nationally, so they can say, oh, we have no choice but to, obey the people's clamor and, recognize, this, the opposition, right? Well, that didn't happen. There were some disturbances and some very unfortunate deaths in Venezuela, but, no revolt happened. From what I understand, Caracas is very much back to business as usual, right? So in the absence of that, Blinken, who is always the hawk, has had a hardline position on everything, and now he's got free reign, decided to throw out the recognition on Thursday, the day before Gonzalez and Machado had to show up at the Tribunal Supremo, right? So, of course, they had the perfect excuse not to go and not to show their supposed actors, which made them look like they have, nothing real to show. So, over the weekend, the weakness of the Guaido 2.0 strategy began to make itself known, right? It began to make itself known that they were backing themselves into a corner with this preemptive, declaration. So now we see, Matthew Miller, the famous Count Chocula of the State Department, yesterday, walking back the recognition of Gonzalez, right? And not only walking it back, but specifically saying that the United States is going to be working in concert with who? Not with Chile, as Jose Luis says, but with Brazil, Colombia, and Mexico, who are the adults in the room, right? These have been the adults in the room here. Instead of, interventionisms and, protagonisms and, not respecting sovereignty and trying to advance, naked, crude geopolitical interest and resource interests, they've been the adults in the room here. They've been doing diplomacy. They've been doing politics, right? As AMLO says so many times, politics was developed so that you don't have to go to war and you don't have to be in constant conflict. That's why politics exists. You do politics. You do diplomacy. You find solutions. You find answers. And now you find Count Chocula in the State Department having to walk back Blinken's hasty declaration on Thursday, which led to a pretty bad weekend for the State Department.
So I'm going to put that here on the screen. This is already subtitled in Spanish for our listeners who view us in Spanish, and I'll let it run so you can see the response by Count Chocula himself.
Is the U.S. ready to recognize another interim president, similar to what happened earlier with Guaido, or is it more just a matter of not recognizing Maduro as the victim?
That's not a step that we are taking today. Where we are today is we are in close contact with our partners in the region, especially with Brazil, Mexico, and Colombia, about a path forward. We continue to urge the Venezuelan parties to begin discussions on a peaceful transition back to democratic norms. We continue to call for transparency and the release of detailed tally votes, while recognizing it's been over a week since the election, and any release of those votes would require close scrutiny given the potential for tampering or manipulation in that time frame. So no, that's not a step that we've taken as of yet, but we continue to make clear that the will of the Venezuelan people needs to be respected, and that's what we're engaging with our partners in the region about.
I'll stop it there because I think he just ends up repeating himself, but really want to emphasize that there's a couple of things here that I would conclude by his intervention. Number one, as you said, the walk back. He is walking back Blinken's decision to recognize Gonzalez's victory. This is clearly a step back. And it's also interesting. He doesn't say a transitional government. He doesn't say a transition to a Gonzalez government. He says a transition to democratic norms, right? Which is a much, much weaker statement, which is to say I think the United States does not feel confident that it can actually successfully engage in regime change in Venezuela. And I think that Mexico's role, Colombia and Brazil as well, has been really critical in that. The OAS wasn't able to get the vote that it wanted at that table because Mexico skipped out.
Yeah.
I think that was also really important. They didn't show up, and therefore they didn't have the votes necessary to actually pursue this. It was like a policy statement saying basically that we don't recognize the result in Venezuela, blah, 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 dictatorship, the usual that you expect from Luis Almagro. And so we bring this up here because it speaks to Mexico's foreign policy, which I think has gone a long way towards defending sovereignty, not just in Mexico, but in the entire region. And of course, before we move on, I do want to also highlight a bit the response by right-wing actors here in Mexico. Felipe Calderon himself, the product of a fraudulent election. I think, it's talking about throwing stones in a glass house. He was calling on basically the armed forces to break with constitutional order, to break with Maduro, to enforce the opposition's wishes. And, we have a tweet here from our Twitter account here, Mexico Solidarity. Follow us there, MEX Solidarity. Mexico's ex-president Calderon calls on Venezuela's armed forces to rise against Maduro's government. Mexicans remember him for usurping power in 2006 and his bloody, militarized drug war. In 2020, he urged fellow rightists to consider an armed uprising to end the pandemic of populism, right? And these are the people that, will publish statements from IDEA saying that they're the democratic defenders, that they're democratic actors. So I think it's worth remembering, where does the right stand on all of this?
Yeah, exactly. And, as I tweeted yesterday, if a coup plotting is going successful, it's kind of invisible, right? The genuine coup plotters are behind the scenes because they want to make it look like a spontaneous popular uprising. The fact that they're having to call for basically a coup out loud is a sign of weakness. It's a sign of weakness, right? If it were really going well, they wouldn't be saying as much, right? And of course, there's also the factor BRICS here, right? There's also the factor BRICS here. Maduro has made the case that if you don't want the oil, we'll send it to BRICS. But there's also been an invitation on the part of BRICS to attend their next meeting. So welcome to the multipolar world. Welcome to the multipolar world. It's the rules are different now.
Yeah. And I think Mexico, again, has played the right strategy, which is let's keep friendly relations with both blocs, right? We have the United States as a neighbor, but that doesn't mean we're going to join in on this, condemnation of Russia. That doesn't mean that we're going to join in on this trade war with China.
Right.
We want to have positive relationships with the BRICS countries as well. One final note, and I mentioned this briefly. I wrote this tweet because, well, to be honest, I do think that there is a danger with the opposition learning all the wrong lessons of the Venezuelan experience. And there's this Twitter account, this influencer who's trying to basically give us lessons, right? And it's calling López Obrador an imbecile, that we need to take care of our democracy. He says the new president has a majority in Congress, actually has a supermajority, and the objective is to take away liberties and convert Mexico into a socialist country. Well, I hope so. That's something I would be in favor of. But of course, passing over the fact that why does Morena have a supermajority in the Congress? Well, because that's what the voters wanted. We'll get into that later at the end of the program. But as I say here, it's hilarious to me that Venezuelan escuálidos think we Mexicans are interested in their advice and analysis. The real danger to Mexican democracy would be the opposition here adopting the anti-democratic and insurrectionist tactics of the Venezuelan right. And that's something that I will not stop saying, because I do think that there are elements, the Calderón wing of Panismo, that are interested in that kind of strategy. All right. So moving on to the next topic here, we wanted to provide a brief update on the situation with Mexico and Ecuador. As we know, they've broken diplomatic relations as a result of the armed invasion of sovereign Mexican territory, the Mexican embassy in Quito, which is now under the safeguard of, remind me who's taking charge of the embassy there in Mexico? Is it Switzerland?
Yeah, I think so.
Anyway, there's a third party that is helping maintain that, but obviously the relations continue to be strained. The inept son of the richest man of Ecuador, who is now president, continues to basically try to provoke a fight with Mexico, continuously bringing it up. But one of the things that we had said on this show was the correct thing for Mexico to do is to act to protect the life of Jorge Glass, who is currently kidnapped by the Ecuadorian state. Again, if you go into another country's
health situation too, in a very delicate.
Exactly. He's in a delicate health situation. He has been for a number of years. This has been documented. But yeah, he has been kidnapped. He is not arrested. He is kidnapped. He is illegally taken from Mexican hands. And so we see this from the Mexican state. Kurt, can you give us more details here? What does this mean?
Foreign Relations came out with a communique that it is requesting a safe conduct for Jorge Glass to the Ecuadorian government, right? And pursuant to the international accords that we discussed when we first mentioned this, right? Not only the Geneva Convention but the Caracas Accords, right? This would be carried out through a third country, right? Per the accords and per the fact that they don't have diplomatic relations at the moment, right? In order to ensure that the asylum that was granted to Glass the day before the storming of the embassy be enacted, become real. That this iniquitous kidnapping of Jorge Glass come to an end, and that they provide the safe contact that under international law they are required to give. They are required to give. So, it goes back to what Jose Luis was saying about coup-loving right wing in Latin America, right? And how that could, spread to Mexico, if the far right decides to go that direction, right? This is a far right in Mexico, which, attacks everything through lawfare, supports, like Felipe Calderon, coups from afar, but they've gotten to the point now where they don't even respect the basic tenets of international law, right? The basic tenets of international law, which is that, consulates and embassies are inviolable because they're sovereign territory of another nation, bringing back the sovereignty point. And this is another example where AMLO's diplomacy was helpful, right? Because when Ecuador did storm the embassy, following the granting of asylum, right? Count Chocula and co. came out with a very lukewarm, message that AMLO said, basically, what the F? And then the White House had to come out with something stronger several days ago, saying, no, we do agree that invading embassies is not a thing, right? And so here we are. So now the question is this only going to stay on paper, or is this now going to become a real thing where the asylum grantee gets the safe conduct that he needs by international law to get to the asylum granting country? That's what's about.
That's what's it.
Yeah.
That you said it, right? Mm-hmm. This is what international law demands. Mm-hmm. It says right here on the text, right? We have likewise asked that in the case of this safe passage, all the humanitarian needs of Jorge Glass be attended to, that he be taken out of prison and taken to a safe location, and that they take care of his health. That is what should happen if we are actually in support of international law, which the U.S.-led international liberal order says that they are. Obviously, we know that it is not always the case, but I think it's worth emphasizing this. Who are the democratic actors? Who are the people who actually defend sovereignty and defend the law? Well, it's these. It's the people that are accused of the opposite. So, all right. And finally, in our losers and haters section, we got our last 10 minutes here to talk about this. Speaking of people trying to break the law, what do we have here? An interesting case here. There is a deliberate push to basically secure via backroom negotiations what they couldn't secure at the ballot box, to change the rules of the game after the fact. So, Kurt, I'll hand it over back to you. What is the opposition trying to do in this case with the push to eliminate the supermajority?
So we've talked about this previously on the show, so we're not going to go back into all the nitty-gritty. But suffice it to say, in summary, that everything we said at the beginning of this program, all this good stuff that's coming out of the Constitutional Committee, right? The trains, the pegging of minimum wage to inflation, public housing for workers and the rent to buy, capping exorbitant salaries, right? The Jóvenes Construyendo el Futuro, the apprenticeship program, and 15 more things are only going through because Morena won the supermajority in the elections, in June, on June 2nd. Right? They won the supermajority in the House and very close enough to it in the Senate that they're going to be going through, right? So the last-ditch recourse of the losing and hating opposition is to now put all the pressure they can on the Electoral Institute to change the calculus of how the seats are allotted by saying that, let's not go back into all this again, that what's called the overrepresentation clause between single member seats and proportional representation seats, a single overrepresentation clause of 8%, should apply to the entire coalition of Morena, Workers' Party, and Green Party, and not to the individual parties, as the Constitution and as the law requires. Right? The constitutional clause that they put in and the laws that they put in, and we've talked about this before. And so what you see here, very nakedly, is the opposition going and meeting with the National Electoral Institute and putting all the pressure they have through their House columnists and, all of their political figures in a sad, pathetic, last-ditch attempt to change the laws after the election, right? When it's widely stipulated that any change in, electoral, calculus and allotments has to happen with a sufficient distance before the election that it can't be affecting, the next election at hand. They're throwing all that all out the window. The entire, legal concept that you can't change electoral law, within a certain time frame before the election, and especially not after it, right? Not too close to the election before it, but definitely not after it. When you lost and you're trying to get in there and have them twiddle the formula so that Morena doesn't get its supermajority, and everybody's on this now. And they're going and whining about it. And they should have thought of this when, they rejected AMLO's electoral reform, when they did the constitutional reform in 96, when they put in and then they took out the clause in the COFIPE, right, the Electoral Regulatory Institute, all of this stuff they did because they thought that in the Peña Nieto years with their Pacto for Mexico, they were going to have their eternal majority forever thanks to the overrepresentation clause. And now they shot themselves in the foot and they look stupid. That's what's going on here.
And I think they know that they're playing with fire here. As we can see in this Twitter string, these meetings that have been happening with some members of the National Electoral Institute have been in secret. And in fact, they confess that they have to put their cell phones in a different room before they're even allowed to start the conversation.
Yeah, and what's up with
so
that?
What's up with that? That tells you a little bit.
Yeah.
It's like Norma Pina's meeting.
Right.
If it's okay to meet with political actors, why didn't you do it at the Supreme Court? Why did you have a secret meeting that was only revealed later?
Yeah.
There's unscrupulous behavior at play here. I don't think the National Electoral Institute will go this far. We mentioned this last time. I don't think they'll do it. But the fact they're considering it speaks to the fact of this problem that we've highlighted a lot on this program, which is the conservative strongholds. There are spaces where these right-wing actors take refuge and try to enact things knowing that they're now on the outside looking in. And they use that power that they have inside of the institutions, the judicial branch, the Electoral Institute, to try to affect public policy, to put things in their favor and against the interests of the clear majority that exists in this country. This is anti-democratic actor. It's one of the themes we've been talking about in this entire episode as well. But of course, I think there's another element here, which is what, Xochitl Galvez, what she represents, kind of the opposition as a whole is trying to do when it comes to this in terms of wanting to turn this into an issue on the streets. So I want to bring up a video here, and we'll close with this last video, which is from Xochitl Galvez that she published only yesterday on Monday, August 5th, where she says they want to steal 10 million votes in the next distribution of the representatives.
Y sus aliados nos quieren robar casi 10 millones de votos en la integración del Congreso. Te explico. En la elección pasada, estos partidos obtuvieron el 54% de los votos, pero a la mala quieren agandallarse el 75% de los espacios en el legislativo. Con esto, un voto que ellos obtuvieron valdría más que un voto obtenido por la oposición. Imagínate, de aprobarse esta sobrerepresentación, Morena y sus aliados podrían cambiar la Constitución a su antojo. No lo podemos permitir.
All right, so I know. Never has the title of this segment been more appropriate. Yeah. She's quite literally the loser. It's interesting to see her try to position herself as some kind of opposition leader, despite the fact that she was soundly rejected by the population. She was a really bad candidate. She committed gaffes constantly. She's actually recording that video from the halls of the Senate, right, using her position as a senator that she did not actually get through votes in order to advance the opposition's agenda. But I think there's a couple of clear things there, which is the part we already said. The opposition wants to change the rules of the game after the final whistle has been blown. They were fine with the rules before. Now they want to change them because they want to deny the supermajority. Again, this is the system that was in place. It was agreed upon by all the parties. And the result that it produced was this. All of this, it's just rhetoric. This thing about one vote being worth more than the other, it's a distortion of the reality, all to impede Morena's agenda, which we began this program elaborating on, that they're proceeding very quickly on. It's all politics. The fact that they're trying to use this as a wedge, we've also heard the Marea Rosa, we've also heard Marea Rosa claiming that they're going to mobilize on the streets, calling for people to protest, because they understand that when it comes to the institutions of power, they don't have the influence they have anymore. Morena does have a supermajority in the Congress. They can change the Constitution because that's what voters wanted. I made this argument consistently. If that is the result that we got on June 2nd, it's not because of a lack of engagement by voters, but because of a very strict engagement. They heard López Obrador say, help us with the Plan C, help us win the supermajority. We want to continue to deepen this transformation, build the second floor, as Claudia says. So deliver us this mandate, and they did.
Absolutely right. And as we've talked about before, if Mexico had a US-UK style entire first past the post system, Morena would have had, if I remember correctly, 86% of the House seats and 92% of the Senate seats, right? So the fact that they're getting all of these proportional representation seats, that's what the system is designed to do, right? But now they're trying to twist it so that they can deny, what they couldn't get in the election. Real Trumpian vibes. It's real Trump trying to go to the secretaries of state and trying to twist things, after the fact, right? But here, it's even sillier, if you can be any sillier than Trump, because they were blown out. They were blown out of the water. So it's now just this rearguard effort to try to stop Morena from getting a 2/3 majority and being able to pass the constitutional reforms. Very sad stuff.
And I think it's important for supporters of Morena to also pay attention.
Yeah.
Because if they do try to pull something, then the people also need to take to the streets and say, respect my vote. I know I voted, right? I went there, que se suelte el tigre, right? And I will go out to the streets as a citizen to say, no. I know what I voted for. Don't try to change the rules after the final whistle has been blown.
Right.
Well, that brings us to the end of the program. As always, it's been a pleasure talking about all of these topics. I'm glad we're doing this as a weekly show because there really is a lot to cover. Even when there's a lot of things happening in the rest of Latin America, there's always something interesting to talk about when it comes to Mexico and in Mexico's place in the region as well. Any parting words for our viewers and listeners, Kurt?
No, my name is Kurt Hackbarth, Jacobin Magazine, Sentido Común, and we will see you for another episode of Soberanía.